Doug Baker, welcome to Second Nature. We're happy to have you here, man, and excited to dig into some of the data that you're bringing to the table today.
Yeah, excited to be here too. Thanks for having me.
You're the Chief Strategy Officer of Shift Active Media. Tell us about what does Shift actually do?
We are, at its simplest level, a marketing agency and consultancy that specializes in cycling and the outdoors. We've been going for around 12 years now. We specialize in PR, media, creative work, but beyond that, we also increasingly specialize in helping brands and organizations find the data and decision making tools to improve their performance, whether that is growth, if that's what they're after, or whether it's just improving membership or the services they provide if it's more organizational based. So we are zero focused in on the things that I guess people are passionate about and spending time outdoors, because that's what we're passionate about, and then servicing them in the field of marketing and audience growth.
Very cool. And we've got a really interesting document to dig into today. And we've got our absolute ringer when it comes to insights. Steve Holmberg joining me today you got a chance to get a preview of this deck, and you had a chance to already send over just a mountain of questions.
Yeah, a mountain of questions for Doug. I can't wait to dive in.
Amazing. Amazing. So, Doug, I want to start off. We have this deck here, which is going to be exclusively available in the Slack channel, which I think all of our listeners are already in. But just in case, if you want to see what we're looking at, we have a research document here called Decoding the Difference. And the main sort of thing was about how cycling and outdoor enthusiasts overlap and how they differ across markets, genders, and mindsets. And we're going to dig into the details today. But where I kind of want to start with this whole discussion is, how did you come to this point to do the research in this way? What was the impetus for this?
I guess there's two founding impetuses. The first is that despite being outdoors people, we're also, particularly part of us in the agency, are data nerds, and we spend a huge amount of time like looking at what data can help us better understand this world, this audience, these pastimes we love. The other more pressing side of it was that we were talking increasingly with brands who operated across more than one category. So we have protection brands that are serving mountain bikers, but also snow sports enthusiasts. We're talking to people who are retailers that have got trail runners coming in, they've got cyclists coming in, and they are serving these different audiences. But actually, what we quite often see is they then treat those audiences quite discreetly. So this is our mountain bike campaign. We're going to launch this snow product. But anecdotally, we knew from having spent time with all the outdoors people in the office and all the people you meet at events and the people you meet at the brands, that it's very rare that you are just one activity as an outdoors person. And actually, increasingly, if you're thinking about like being a consumer and a customer centric organization, you're going, well, actually, we should understand their relationship with more than just one sport, the main thing we're talking to them about at any one time. And we've been seeing a few bits of data sources from some of our clients about their own audiences, particularly the retailers, and understanding there was that crossover. But we wanted to take a view that wasn't tied to any one retailer or one particular territory, and actually take a step back and go, okay, let's talk to a whole bunch of outdoor enthusiasts of different sorts of disciplines and backgrounds at the same time, and actually see where those overlaps are and see what's similar and also what's different across the different audiences. I mean, I've kind of mentioned it already, but this is our initial cut of the data and the things that we initially pulled out as most interesting. But it's also a data set that we're still planning on mining for more insights and going deep on particular subjects in the future. So hopefully this is just like the starting point for using this to better understand how, all these different outdoor enthusiasts and their passions overlap and differ.
That's great. It's an amazing first starting point to dive into, and I have a ton of questions. But as you talked about the overlap, what were some of the key findings that you had in terms of sport participation?
A lot of the findings were intuitively made sense and reinforced what we thought we might know, but it was good to see that it came through. So on the first slide, we did see the highest participation rates being among those sports with like the lowest barriers to participation. So hiking and riding a bike outdoors, because you don't need to live near a mountain to be able to ride a bike outdoors. And obviously sort of hiking is a fairly low cost. You just need some outdoors, and you can go and with a decent pair of shoes, go and enjoy yourself. So we saw relatively high levels of just participation in that overall. But actually the other thing we saw is that almost everyone wasn't a single activity enthusiast. They would participate in different activities. So that first hypothesis of that overlap, that there would be one there, was reinforced. And I think that some people who are just doing hiking maybe do a couple of other things, but the more you got into those sports or activities or pastimes that require more investment of time or money, the more you found, with one key exception, that actually they tended to then just do more and more things. So if you're a really engaged climber, it's likely you're going to also be doing other outdoor activities. If you are engaging in mountaineering, same sort of story. If you're engaging in trail running, like I think on the average is 3 outdoor activities that you're going to participate in. The only outliers within that we thought interesting were open water swimming. Actually, quite often had a relatively low overlap. Quite a lot of open water swimming and some hiking was quite often a combination that sort of person didn't necessarily then engage in other outdoor activities. That was just a very focused thing, if that was their favorite thing. And the other one was cycling, but very specifically within that was high spending road cyclists as being almost a different cultural group that perhaps overlaps in terms of their riding a bike, but culturally is quite different from, say, being a mountain biker. So we can dig into that in a bit more detail if you want later.
Yeah, why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a couple of factors. The first is position and location. Like I think a lot of your engagement in the outdoors is predicted to a certain extent about where you're based. If you are based in Oregon versus if you're based in central London or central Berlin, you're going to have different access on a day-to-day basis to different outdoor spaces to participate in different outdoor activities. You do see a higher index of people engaging and spending high on road activities around major cities because there are more roads available. Even though it's always important to remind people, road cyclists do it because they love spending time in nature. People may laugh at them that they're still on the concrete, but they are closer to nature than they would have been in the cities. The other thing is I think there is also a cultural connection to elite sport that is more central to that engaged road rider audience that you don't necessarily always get in all other outdoor activities. A road rider, particularly a high-spending road rider, has, on average, are much more likely to be looking at the World Tour racing scene, which is a very different thing in terms of your motivations, what excites you about it, than some of the sports that, whilst there is obviously an elite component to things like climbing, you don't necessarily see it as being so central to someone's engagement with that sport, with that pastime. So I think it's a couple of things. I think it is geographic, but it was also just culturally that is more centered around a competitive fan-based activity, which drives like that culture, which doesn't necessarily then drive you to want to spend more time in sort of like nature, these other activities, as opposed to if you're spending time in the mountains, whether it's climbing or throwing yourself down a mountainside on your downhill bike, you are more likely to then be near other activities, to try other activities. You're not necessarily looking at elite sportsmen as being the driving kind of like interesting factor. It's like, how else can I spend more time outdoors?
The mountain biker in me is trying so hard not to make fun of road cyclists. I think it's interesting though when you think about location specific, because you want to sort of celebrate these locations, and so many times I'll be on a hike and be like, oh, I wish I had my bike here, or you find a spot where you're like, oh, I could come back here and ride, where the connection, you talked about open water swimming and you talked about road cycling, is like that's the area that but maybe you're not exploring what's off the trail. Whereas when you're mountain biking, you can see a climbing wall, you could see a trail that's, running only or whatever. And maybe it opens you up to it in that way too. Like you're celebrating and sort of interpreting the location in many different ways, right?
It's one of the most interesting things about gravel. Like, obviously, you have lots of mountain bikers laughing at roadies for discovering riding single track and then riding hardtail bikes and calling them something else. But actually, what's amazing is that you get these people who enjoy this more endurance style sport that perhaps need to get through a certain amount of like road before they can hit countryside. But it does then give them a more limited, but an ability to get off that track. And I think you see it reflected in some of the marketing and storytelling that happens around gravel, which has drawn in quite a lot of road riders because they are more likely to become gravel riders than mountain bikers on average. Because they do have these stop moments where they just stop. They aren't riding anymore. They are looking at the view. They are spending more time in nature because they've been enabled to. So actually, I think that whilst there is obviously a portion who are mainly focused on drinking espressos and watching the bike racing in a cafe after their ride around a park in a major city. But there's also lots of road riders who now they're given the ability to spend more time exploring off the beaten track. I think that may also prompt them to think about things like trail running or other activities they might be doing, which is maybe they're not surrounded by amazing like Rocky Mountain landscapes, but there is nature near almost everyone that they could be spending more time in. And it's actually interesting. We did ask one question, I'm jumping around already, sorry, but we did ask one question about whether people were participating more or less frequently in their favorite activity in the last 12 months. And actually trail running was the one that was had the highest, more likely to be participating more often. So there is something interesting about, like, it being one of the other growth areas that, like, gravel riding and trail running to me have this more like emerging, like very accessible and bringing more people to. Whereas actually to do great mountain biking, you do have to find good mountain biking surfaces. They're so capable now. You quite often have to find quite challenging conditions quite often to get the most out of them. But anyone can go and find a trail with trail running or with gravel that entertains them.
It's almost like it's the gateway drug to the outdoors. It seems like trail and gravel could be that entry for them. That's really interesting. And sort of continuing with some of the findings that you had, you ended up running a segmentation on the different types of bikers that are off-road. Can you tell us a little bit of what that segmentation is and what you found there?
We did one thing, which is, I guess, a relatively simple piece of analysis, which is where we looked at the different types of riders and then their relative like engagement with other activities. We did see that mountain bikers and gravel riders are more likely to participate in snow sports and camping and in trail running. Then we also ran, I guess, depending on how nerdy we want to get, but like a cluster analysis. So we put in all of the variants that we found from every respondent, where we'd ask them about their mindset, their motivations, their activity, and we just allowed the algorithm that we're using to then find, without presupposing what they're going to be, these clusters of similar audiences to try and find, are there certain types of overlaps of activity that happen most often. So yeah, we basically found five groups, and this, although riders were in there in a relatively high amount because we obviously slightly oversampled cyclists because we were interested in it. It was looking at people from all outdoor backgrounds. So we had 5 groups called: one, the Uber Outdoors; one was called Cycling Plus; another called Cycling Centric; we had the occasional water and snow sports person; and then we had hikers. Now, each cluster is not obviously completely everyone in that cluster is not completely identical, but they tend to have certain shared traits. So the Uber Outdoors, I guess, is also like the most desirable kind of audience that most outdoor brands or services would be thinking about. These are the people who are very likely to be participating in multiple outdoor activities frequently, to be spending high, a relatively young audience as well, slightly male skew, and more motivated than others to like push themselves, learn new skills, and more likely to find them in specialist media and kind of the more kind of like the newer social channels, so TikTok and Instagram. So you've got that kind of core audience, which is like the true multi-outdoor sports person who is going to be really engaged in it overall, and probably really engaged with the kind of communications or the media that the industry is putting out. Then you got Cycling Plus. So that audience tends to do one type of cycling and then will do something else as well with relatively frequently. So it would be a snow sport, a water sport, or hiking. So although they're cycling centric, they do engage in something else, usually at least one other activity, pretty frequently. Then you've got the cycling centric audience, which probably has more road in it, which is more likely to be you're very into cycling and you occasionally do something else. And that occasional other thing will be relatively low barrier to entry. So camping, hiking, and some trail running. Then you've got the occasional water and snow sports audience, which, again, we didn't have this exact data in the data set, but is more likely to, I think we see as being those who travel to do an activity on a more seasonal basis. So I'll travel to go skiing or snowboarding. I will travel to go to the seaside and during that, or I'll travel on holiday and do some stand-up paddleboarding, whatever it may be. And then finally, you've got the hikers. So this audience, like, they do only hiking and maybe camping, and they don't really engage with media as much. They don't, it's sort of specialist media. They don't really engage with social media as much. They don't spend as much. In fact, they're probably the purest, like, outdoor, just to be in the outdoors space, rather than necessarily building a skill or challenging themselves in another way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And going back to sort of the beginning part of your Uber Outdoors, and that's where everybody's
Mm.
focused, and that energy is that a big segment or is that a small portion of the population? Like, I don't know, Aaron, if you were to guess which one was the biggest, I would guess cycling centric would probably be the biggest out of all of them. But any thoughts on size and where that sharp point is?
There wasn't a huge like delta. It wasn't like 70% recycling centric. There was a good portion of people in each of these groups. Within some of the Uber Outdoors, you'll have the slightly less engaged, the more engaged, but it's like it was a significant enough audience that I don't think if you were a business or a brand that you'd worry that it was just a really tight group. Actually, there seems to be a fairly sizable audience, and I think when you also combine that with spend and how engaged they are, they're a really interesting audience to go after and to serve. I think the flip side is almost like, and it's almost in some ways the easiest to serve because those things that people who make brands for the outdoor tend to love to talk about, which is like, look how well we made this product, or look, we'll put it in social media and we'll put it in specialist like cycling or snowboarding magazines that all not magazines anymore, show my age, but in social media where you, like or specialist websites where these people spend their time. In fact, if some actually quite often the challenge then is how do you scale from there out to a slightly wider audience who aren't as engaged with it. I mean, we talk quite often in on the cycling side, but also on the I guess the more general outdoor side, like climbing and stuff, and we work with some pack brands, is that you do have this core prosumer audience who engage with this media and actually quite a lot of their job. And that might be it might be people in store and retailers, but it may also just be people who just love this. And in every if you've been out like Aaron riding a mountain bike, there'll always be two or three people in that group who are super invested, know loads about mountain biking, some who know more about tech and brands than others, and others who just generally just allow going, if I need to know something about like what wheels I should get next, I'm going to ask Aaron, I'm going to ask the guy who was always keeping up to date with it. So you do tend to find these like pockets of like these even within like riding groups and social groups, the more and less engaged. And actually, if you can build a good relationship with them, that quite often then diffuses to the wider audience. But again, that comes down to like how easy do you make it for them to tell your story, whether that's specific products or like the more inspirational stuff.
Yeah, I love how you broke it out. Right, it's really nice to see and show that there are different types of consumers that are there. It's not mountain bikers are not just one type of person and one way that they engage with sports. That they're actually you have listed here five, and it is interesting to learn about that influencer model, sort of as you're talking about, and on a micro scale, that's really important. But it's fascinating to see.
It's really interesting the breakout here that you have too of like the age groups that kind of define those, and then along with that, how much they're actually spending, which ones are the highest spending. And what shocks me, I think, the most is that the Uber Outdoors is the youngest, and it's also the highest spend when it comes to the different categories. I, in my own life, I feel like now that I'm a grown up, I'm actually spending more on stuff. And one thing that I feel as a grown up, athlete, outdoors person is that I actually have all the gear that I need. I'm the most prepared. I remember being young and excited to compete, but my bike was always clapped out and I was wearing jeans where now I've got all the technical gear. I've got all the perfect stuff and I can actually afford to buy the product that I want to be using for these activities. So this goes against like what I would have actually thought. I would have thought that the younger people were kind of trying to make it work, where people that were a little bit older would be spending more to get like that thing that they've always wanted.
So the other thing that we tend to see is that we do tend to get a slightly skewed view about what high spend is when we work in the category, because we quite often ourselves are really highly engaged, passionate enthusiasts. When someone in here talks about an entry level bike, quite often they've just locked in their mind like $2,500, $3,000 an entry level, because that's enthusiast 105 group set road bike, or a decent mountain bike these days with full sus. You're talking about that sort of money. The reality is that represents like 10% of people who buy a bike or own a bike, or like even like depending on which country, and 2 to 10% of it. Like when we talk about like the high spec, these people are spending a lot more than the average out of enthusiasts. But even so, we probably have a skewed view about what high spend is. So actually, if you're talking about just good quality entry level, like there are plenty of people in their 20s and 30s who can afford a bike or the equivalent equipment in other sports, where they are going to spend $250 on a great pair of trainers to make the most of their running, where they are going to spend $2,500 on a real road bike from a real, or a gravel bike from a really good reputable producer. So I think there's going to like two things. First is that it does skew old as a category compared to some other categories, which makes us feel forever young. But also we tend to get a skewed view about what high spend really is.
Interesting. I wonder if a lot of these outdoor brands have appropriately set target markets to match that. I can tell you Red Bull's target market is 18 to 34, but I've got to wonder, are they actually thinking about that when, are the outdoor brands in line with what you're saying here of like who is the target market here? And it appears to be skewing quite a bit older, which makes me feel pretty good. I'm right in my prime.
Now's your time.
So there's two things, aren't there? There is who actually buys your product, and then what's the message, or what is the aspiration that you are also part of as a brand. Like I as someone who is definitely in the mid phases of their life, like I would like to consider myself younger at heart than necessarily I am on my birth certificate. So I think that there is also a strategy. Sometimes we believe that we are going to retain those people who already like our brand. Our job is to win over the next generation of riders. But then when you actually look at the behavior, where do most brands invest like their time and their money? In our category, it is more on Instagram, which is a fairly mass platform now. It isn't on TikTok, because actually that does still skew very young. And actually, when you're given the choice to two, they will probably go to the older, or at least the more mass channels. Whereas you compare that to the investment that we see from the likes of like Nike or music artists or like entertainment targeting other people, that will be the first channel that they decide to try and like build a campaign through. Whereas it is still secondary, and probably rightly so for a lot of the brands in this space.
Yeah, I love hearing that again, just to reiterate what you just said, is that the main focus due to age, the social media that people are focusing is that Instagram side of things, and that's largely for inspiration. You've had some interesting insights also on where they're finding out to gain knowledge, where they're learning from in terms of platforms. Where are they learning?
I mean, the over and over, and it's actually really consistent across different categories. Different categories engage more or less with media overall, but generally, social media, and I include in this, maybe not rightly, but I'll include YouTube in here just for ease. Just now, YouTube and social media is where people go to indulge their passions. Like, it is easier to just find the content and find the people and find the communities or find the creators that represent the most interesting parts of your passion most consistently. Now, that also is then backed up for some categories with specialist media, and some people who go deeper, it goes with specialist media. So whether, we're talking like websites mainly on the whole, and then for some categories, it will also be, if there's a key racing component. If you want to watch the World Cup cross country downhill, you're going to have to also watch that OTT through Discovery or another platform, depending on where you're on the world. And then, I think that on the whole, those three then make up the basis for almost every category and how they find their inspiration. You will sometimes have things that then bleed into the mainstream. So you will have Netflix with sort of documentaries that sort of particularly will bring to life or maybe highlight or support those specialist interests. But that's going to be the exception, not the rule. Mainly, it's about you curating your feed or your subscriptions so that you can look at those spaces. And there are obviously smaller places that people look. Like some people prefer just hearing the sound of voices, listen to podcasts, and I encourage that, obviously, in this context. But and there's also some people who engage in Substack, but those are kind of like a specific group who want to go a certain way. The majority of people, it's about social is where you follow your passions, of which YouTube is obviously more entertainment platform, but is also one of those places as well.
Yeah. I mean, I can't tell you how seen I feel through this data. Not only in terms of age, my activities, what social platforms, I feel like you know more about me than I think.
And I think, interestingly, for brands, there is sometimes this like deep sense of panic for perhaps like marketers or people in businesses who've been in the role for longer, and you have something like TikTok that emerges, and you're going, "Oh my God, we're not on this. Are we going to miss out on the next generation?" What's interesting is that actually, when you look at the incremental reach, actually it's not huge. Like most of the people on TikTok are also on Instagram. Now they use it very differently and less frequently. But if you're thinking about overall reach, the ability to reach people and a limited bandwidth in a business to be able to be on every platform, actually, like you can select a couple of these channels and reach a significant proportion of your total audience. And because these channels work, they might look the same. Like a reel might look on Instagram a bit like something on TikTok, and we do see some cross fertilization. Really, with the bandwidth and the resources that most brands and companies have, because most of the brands and companies in our world are SMEs when you compare it to the wider mainstream business world. We don't have infinite resources. So actually, quite often it's much better to pick one or two and be brilliant at those rather than trying to stretch yourself really thin across all those platforms. So it's about knowing where people are, but it's also about working about like incrementally, like trying to get the biggest audience whilst not overstretching yourself.
Yeah. It's almost like the 80-20 rule, where 80% sort of gets covered with the first 20% of your effort. That's good. And so that's a great sort of thought and recommendation for retailers and brands. What other thoughts do you have sort of coming out of this research and clients that you've talked to on recommendations for them to think about as they try to reach this consumer and connect with them and sell?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that we also didn't necessarily cover from that point, but also it is interesting that there is variety around who people then choose to follow, because saying that 80% or 60% of your audience are on TikTok or on YouTube or Instagram is one thing. You don't put up a post, it reaches 80% of like your audience. Like obviously it's sitting alongside everything else as well. So it's also working out like who you were with and who they want to follow. So again, increasingly we're seeing, and interestingly, just looking, say, comparing road and mountain bike, like it's more important in mountain bike to be working with creators, whereas in road, actually, it is like people are more likely to follow brands or established media brands, like comparatively. So depending on your category, it's always important to think about like who you're reaching through in there. I think beyond that more inspirational reaching people on an ongoing basis, there's also then the process where they then go through and research. You go from that moment where, like, whilst I think every super enthusiast is always thinking about what they next need to buy to incrementally improve their experience or just have some nicer stuff. But you do change how you engage with media at that point, and channels change and how important they are. So you do suddenly obviously see things like Google coming in, and actually manufacturers' websites become, or brands' websites become really important, because whilst they know that you are not going to be entirely balanced in how you describe your products, you think it's the best thing in the world, and you're not going to necessarily give a balanced thing. Everyone will do, particularly when you're in space where people do more research and are interested. And in fact, researching new products and something you love is quite a fun process. So people would commit quite a lot of time to it. So they will end up spending quite a lot of time with your touch points. So actually, there are some categories where you can have a fairly just like workman or work person like website that can just like have like some basic features. In an enthusiast space, your website can do some really heavy lifting to build that desirability and like the preference and the understanding of your product or brand. It won't necessarily be the thing to finally get you over the line. That's going to be good reviews in specialist media or coverage in YouTube. Well, actually, interestingly, for people who do use TikTok is really influential. For Facebook, it isn't very influential for people who use Facebook. So there is an interesting difference of usage pattern. But overall, if you are really well covered in specialist, you've got a website that tells a good story, and then you are featured quite often on YouTube, because people do look for reviews on YouTube. It's not just the traditional sort of media that people are looking for. That suddenly changes that mode, and they go for inspiration, just building preference awareness of what you're doing. To actually I'm going to buy this pair of shoes, I'm going to find the right nutrition plan for my next run or my next nutrition product, then that does switch to different channels. So it's thinking about how does my brand turn up in their lives when they're just looking for entertainment, education between their next adventures, and then how do I turn up when they're actually in that research phase, which is more lean forward and takes different channels into account. So I guess that's just like the media side, and I guess we can sort of also think a bit about mindsets and motivations as well. And actually, I think what was interesting about this is there will be very specific ways that this comes to life, but it's also one of the areas that's most interesting where there is this overlap between these audiences, because there are some really consistent triggers of why people start an activity, and then also what keeps them doing that activity And actually, so when you think about the high level, what you're trying to connect to the people around, actually, there's just a really functional thing. Actually, the like starting doing certain activities from a young age makes you much more likely to do it in the future, which is kind of expected, but also interesting and does vary by activity. Then a desire to spend more time outdoors. It's kind of written on the whole category name, isn't it? Outdoor, like out the outdoor category. But it should never look like, why do people do it? Because they want to be aware, they want to be in this place that gives you these emotional benefits, that like pulls you out of your day to day, that fills you with awe at the world around you, and also improve your physical health. Like those are the things that consistently drive people to do these things. And actually, if you are a brand trying to appeal to quite a wide outdoor audience, like you can these messages and these themes can be a starting point to attract to a really talk to a really broad audience. And then actually, what then keeps people engaged is interesting, because the factors stay quite similar as to why you started, to why you keep going. You know, stay physically healthy, enjoy wilderness. The biggest rising factor, so the thing that jumps up the most between why I started activity and why I'm doing it now across all the different categories, is actually it is my mental well-being. So people don't necessarily start these activities explicitly to feel better mentally. They quite often do it to get in shape, to spend more time outdoors. But when they're asked why they keep doing it, it's because it makes them feel better, like mentally, emotionally. And that's actually a really big hook as to why like we do all those things. So just thinking about the messaging, like there are some really universal truths about why we do what we do, which isn't necessarily tied to whether a boa fix, like a boa is a better sort of like thing to put on a shoe than a lace, but is also like it is really powerful into like just thinking about making sure that these keep coming through from brands beyond, and remembering why people do it beyond the talking about products that obviously brands love to talk about.
It's interesting to think about how brands might message this to sort of get the most bang for their buck as well, right? Like, do you focus on the entry point consumer into getting people into the outdoor industry? Do you focus on intensifying the activity? Or do you focus on speaking their language and the thing that matters to them most now that they're locked into it?
Yeah, and I think it's a question of, well, quite often it will be, well, what are you who are you serving, like because you will usually have like, and I it's very unusual that a brand doesn't have its existing portfolio an idea about who it wants to serve with their products. If you are selling an incredibly dialed in $350 trail shoe, it's not going to be in your interest in the short term, and probably not within your capacity to necessarily bring loads of people into trail running right now. If you are a major shoe manufacturer that is selling a range of price points, then actually you should be looking at going, there are moments, there are parts of our communications where we can really dial into the specifics and get like into the details. But there's also an opportunity to reach a much wider audience that then sort of like builds into that over time, and just being conscious about what you're doing at each time. But I think you can sometimes accidentally exclude the beginner by being overly technical or being overly focused on like selling to people who already know what they're doing. It's really, I think it should be really hard to exclude the experienced person if you're talking about the things that are universally shared or motivating about getting into the sport. I think if you talk about those fundamental drivers, yes, there are ways to make it feel a little bit sort of like too basic, but there are some things that will motivate people to get into a category in the first place, whether it's like that time in the outdoors, or like the wonder that like nature can bring, like as you're running, that it speaks just as well to someone competing in like 5 ultras in a year, to someone who's just thinking about like running out their door for the first time. So I think that you can when you get big enough to tell those stories, you can reach a large audience. And if you're smaller, quite often you are quite often focused on those more technical things. Then you can go and find those more hardcore groups of fans who will be engaging in maybe smaller reach channels, but ones where your message around more technical excellence and performance would play better.
Yeah, and I want to touch back on the kids idea too, because that seems like such an interesting opportunity for brands overall. And it was, I don't want to lose the fact of what you said of one of the main motivations people have for starting the sport is starting at a young age. And when we look at some of the data, at least we see in the US from like the Aspen Institute, et cetera, um, there's a hyper specific specificity that's forming with kids. They're sort of choosing one, maybe two sports at a very young age, and that's what they play. And it ends up being a very competitive game that they play. Um, but if we think about all of these kids and the mental health crisis that we're sort of in amongst kids, it's interesting that you point out that people are riding their bikes for the mental health reason, right? For the wellness side of things. And how do we potentially, I see this as a great opportunity for everybody, but how do we connect kids to that portion? The sport can be fun and it can be sort of great for mental health, but it doesn't necessarily have to be competitive. It can, but I think that's the interesting role it plays. And I think there are other sports too, probably you found like skiing, etc., that probably has a lot of that same connection. That sport can just be fun. It doesn't have to be the competitive one sport. I'm going to do this as my almost career as a kid. So I love that learning in your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I mean, how long we got for the discussion around this? Like, there's so much stuff that feeds into that question, and I think there's some regional stuff as well. So I'd see that. So thinking across different countries. So I'll just take the UK and the US for example. Both, I think, actually have some youth participation decline around sports in general challenges, but we don't necessarily see the same hyper competitive single sport focus in the UK. It's a general malaise. But so I think it shows up in different places. It shows up in different places in different ways. But I think the fundamental underlying there are factors. There are some really consistent truths, particularly across like Western, like what we used to call the developed world, is that we see a far lower rate of unstructured play from like a really early age. Like there is just more clubs. There's less unsupervised time outside. It used to be there was nothing to do, so you get on your bike and you go and see someone else and you ride around for a bit, and then and with that, it's like I'm not going to point fingers at a different generation because if video games were this good when I was young, I'd struggle to leave the house. Like Fortnite compared to like what was on the Sega Mega Drive or it's like the Sega Master System, like they weren't very good video games. So I think the reality is there's a lot of stuff pulling people inside, but I think what is really powerful about the bike is that whilst there can be a competitive element to it, what I'd really like to see, and I think in some groups are really good at doing in terms of when you're engaging people and kids with bike and bike competency for the first time, don't necessarily connect it as the pathway is then to racing. Like that's not the only way. Make sure that it can just be a tool to like have fun, to get around for transport. And I think there is a lot of fundamental talk to cities and local government, because it is local government where this happens in most countries, is the infrastructure so that parents will feel comfortable with people like and kids going out, because you don't want to have to wait until your parents have the free time to take you riding. So I think that like cycling to a certain extent has this position, because snow sports, like it'd be great to all live near a beautiful mountain range, but we don't. Whereas riding a bike outdoors is a baseline physical activity where people can get out and just enjoy doing something outside and physical, which doesn't necessarily have to lead to structured sport. I would also love to see structured cycling as a sport become more popular, but that doesn't have to be the reason. I think it could be a tool for more people to then come back to it later in life and for it to be a more engaged thing. And now, obviously, it's different in Europe where people just get around every day. I think it is more common in the Western and the English speaking world.
I think one of the best things over here in the States that has happened for cycling is this NICA organization that formed a handful of years ago of getting a lot of high schoolers out and racing and just getting up on bikes. And I mean, it's actually turned out world champions at this point, but but NICA has been a huge thing, not just for developing racers, but just getting people into the sport of mountain biking, getting people on two wheels and developing that first layer of confidence and control on the bike that they hopefully will carry throughout their entire lives.
And I think that's a really good point, Aaron, in terms of that confidence and control. I think one of the reasons that you do see that actually it's the second highest percentage of it being a key reason why you do the sport you do, starting when you're young, was cycling. So snow sports is the highest, mountaineering was the bottom. but cycling is the second most likely to say this because you did it from a young age. Building those basic core skills, like that phrase of like, it's like riding a bike. Well, it isn't like riding a bike if you didn't ride a bike much when you were younger. So when you do, if you would come and take us up as an adult, and you might be in a place which doesn't have the perfect infrastructure, you might be nervous around traffic, or you might not be like, might not want to go and join a group of people riding because you're not confident you can even ride properly. So there is that basic skill level that you kind of like almost want to instill in people early in their life. And speaking out the other side of my mouth towards that, anyone, it can just be for fun. Creating, like, I think one of the things and one of the successes of some of the more organized sports is, when people are young, quite often looking up at heroes. And I think that sports brands particularly have been very good at creating inspirational heroes, like in a lot of team sports or individual sports. I don't think necessarily we've been as good at creating these heroes, particularly in the English speaking markets, that a young person would look up to and say, like, I want to get on a bike, and when I'm riding to the next signpost or I'm riding trail, I'm thinking of, like, I am imagining I am that person, because they just don't have as much visibility. So I think there's also something around, you can't be what you don't see, which is obviously like a lot of what say Nike did around obviously the women's strategy when they first got into women's sport, was like, let's put elite female athletes on a pedestal, because that's step one, is seeing that this is real and it could be something that I do. It's the same thing for cycling, mountain biking. I think that, like, these sports, if you put these people and make them aspirational, it's a starting point of inspiration, particularly for younger people, to think about, actually, that could be for me, whether I end up being sort of a competent sort of competitor or not. Like, it's like an exciting starting point.
Very much so.
None of this is in the deck.
But maybe that's a good transition. This seems like just the tip of the iceberg of what you can cover, not only in this deck, but in other sports, potentially in terms of research. Is that true for you guys?
So one of the best things about a data set this side, so we spoke to just under 5,000 respondents, and we've looked at people, and we got people from the US, UK, Germany, Italy, Spain, and France. And we've got a good geographic split. We've got a split across different disciplines and different activities. It's one of the things, you can begin to cut this any different ways and begin to group people in different ways. We run obviously one cluster analysis, but it might be that we also want to take a particular look at people who spend a certain level, or people who, what's the audience look like that does snow sports and does mountain biking? That would be a really interesting group to dive into. So I think what's good about this sort of data set, and whether that's something that we own, or increasingly whenever we're working with clients, like, build your own data set, because actually quite often, particularly this quantitative stuff, you can keep going back to and looking at it from new angles when some other question comes up. There's lots more we will and can do with this data set. And if we wanted to look at a trail running audience, understand specifically, like, how are they different to these other kind of outdoor audiences, and where is the overlap and where there's the opportunity and what are their characteristics, like, we can do that. So I think that it's an exciting piece, because these are the things that, like, jumped out. This makes it sound like we didn't work very hard on it. These are the things that we first found when we went into the data, but there is so much more we can dig into to begin to understand more. And it's just why you get nerdy excited about big data sets, because it's all about just interesting questions about people's behavior and who they are. And you can then go and layer on more questions. Like, all good research will prompt 30 other questions that you want to ask. And quite often that means going actually talking to real people, which is just as fun as data. But I think that what's really exciting is that this just, like, begins to prompt and get you to ask more questions of the data, and then more questions just generally of your audience. And the upshot of all that is you just understand who you're talking to better. So hopefully to serve them better and make a better product, which is a win-win in my mind, because everything we do is hopefully just making people's enjoyment of their passions, their pastimes, like, something that they get more out of because of the equipment or the services that our clients can give them.
This feels so foundational to that. I think one of the things you said too is, like, actually being able to speak to people in the way that they're expecting to be spoken to, or catching them at the right time. I don't think there's a stronger trigger for that, for building brand affinity, building sales on top of that. If you know what the people are looking for, where they're looking for it, and how they're you can really just target it in so perfectly, and dial it for all the right people, and approach them in the way that they're expecting to be approached. And so much of us, I think specifically in the outdoor industry, we're such heavy participants, but we're so biased as well. And so I think a lot of the data in here kind of challenged the way that I think about everything. And I've got to imagine for the other experts in the outdoor industry to look through this data. There's some surprises in here. I think one of the biggest surprises for me, I'm looking at, I guess this is slide 31. I thought that the pandemic was a huge boom for the outdoor industry, but it turns out it ranks 8th in motivating people to get outdoors. So I'd love to hear you actually. Can we talk about the pandemic and its influence on the outdoor industry?
Yeah, I'm trying not to talk about the pandemic much anymore, but yes, the that was really interesting for us as well. So I think let's first like just frame the exact data point we're using here, because there's obviously different ways we could come at it. This is for your favorite. So we looked at people and said like, what was your, asked them about their favorite activity, and then we looked at what was the motivation for getting into their favorite activity. And anecdotally, I think we can all think of a couple of people in our lives, or people we've come across, or stories we've heard about, I got into X activity during the pandemic and now I love it. What's interesting, and you can see this in overall participation rates. So I'm just going to take cycling as like a thing in terms, just like one example. We saw enormous boom in particularly like casual cycling, but people also got into like, really got into it. And we saw Zwift numbers go up, and people do road riding, people mountain biking, e-bikes go up. What we've actually seen in the last few years is actually almost participation return to what it was pre-pandemic, give or take a few percentage points and some interesting regional variations to a very similar level. So people may have bought these bikes, people may have like ridden with their families, they may have tried their first like event, they might have done, they might ride slightly more often. But when life returned and they could travel again, and they could go to sporting events, and they could go like visit other cities, or maybe they just spent more time going to work and back because they can't just work out of their home anymore, the room left for these new activities got squashed. And actually, what it seems that some people probably stayed, but also some people just naturally were probably phasing out of being participant anyway. We've actually ended up with a very similar enthusiast audience in that particular world. Now, I think it probably does vary, and there probably will be, if we would dig in further, there are probably some categories where it ranks higher. But overall, I think it's one of those ones that we've actually, the pandemic in hindsight looks like a very strange spike in change of behavior, to which a lot of behaviors returned to the normal baseline that we had before. Some haven't. Hybrid working is definitely now a common thing. This style of interview is now far more common. Like the fact we spend more time. There are some things that have changed, but there are some things that have returned to what they were before. And actually, we were surprised as well. And I think the other thing it says is that actually you may also try something that you now still do occasionally more often. So interestingly, in the US, there's quite a large portion of people who ride a bike. A large proportion before the pandemic ride a bike, but ride it quite infrequently. So there's probably quite a lot of people who like got into it, got a bike, or maybe got their bike back out of their garage or their shed, and actually are now riding occasionally. But it's not their favorite thing. Their favorite thing is something else, then they are doing that instead. So what it tells me is that it brought a lot of people and exposed them to. It feels like we need to do more investigation into how that might change by different activities. It might be that some activities do over-index on this, but actually it probably added something. If it did add something to your outdoor repertoire, it probably didn't introduce your favorite activity. It probably is something that's like another thing that you might do occasionally around that activity. And the final point in participation is actually the thing that's most robust, is that people who really like cycling and do it most often is a really stable number across lots of different categories. And actually the things that were going up before the pandemic have continued to go up, and the things that were going down are continuing to go down. So actually overall enthusiasts are really stable base across different activities because it's something they love. And it's the more casual, I've just come into this and now left again audience that characterized COVID and doesn't seem to have hung around for the most part in a lot of categories. There are probably exceptions that we can dive into a bit more detail over time, but that was our big, I guess, headline finding.
Connecting some of the dots that you have shared today, I think is really interesting in terms of how do retailers take a look at it now? Because a lot of the retailers of the bike industry sort of have just starting to come out of the inventory challenges that they've had. And so they've had a good number. They didn't have inventory, then they had a lot of inventory, and now they're sort of managing that. But from what I heard from you is that there is a lot of overlap with other sports. And it is that sort of ability to connect. And COVID, it wasn't necessarily going to create their favorite sport, but it created a sort of the next adjacent sport to the thing that they love doing. And the ways that people are doing it seems to be things like gravel, or, and we didn't talk about this, but e-bikes or e-mountain bikes, is making that more accessible for people. So instead of trying to bring in maybe a ton of new consumers, maybe let's exclude kids, let's get kids in there, but maybe it's not getting more people in, but it's broadening the breadth of the cycling that people loves. I mean, everybody loves a bike, everybody wants more bikes. How do you sort of expand that out and share that passion that way? Because a lot of the passion, again, what I heard from you, is coming from the cyclists that they're riding with, right? Like, it's a very local influence that's happening with those consumers. And so how do you kind of continue to just build and bridge out from there, which is really fascinating. That's a different approach than I was thinking in the past, which is how do we get more people in instead of how do we get the same people doing more sort of types of activities.
Yeah, and I guess there's a few different things you can think about, like your like a retailer strategy. So you do in some ways you think about whether there's an REI, or actually like there's lots of like very high quality retailers in Germany and like Central Europe, where you have really high quality like climbing equipment, skiing equipment, running EMTBs, all in one space, because you're speaking to someone who has like you know brings all these passions together. And actually their thing is much more around like just overall level of quality across a lot of areas, rather than I guess the traditional bike shop, which kind of like we're going to go all the way from this $200 kids bike to this 10 grand S Works, and like and we're just bikes for everyone. Whereas actually what we consistently see is that actually the most stable part of this is the enthusiast. So actually, is it more useful to be a bike for everyone, or actually is that the job of a like just a like a I guess a you know probably not use the right analogy in the US, but like a Dix or like a mainstream sports thing. They can sell the cheap bikes. Actually, the main job of an enthusiast thing is go. Actually, we sell mountain bikes and ski. Actually, we focus more on enthusiasts and quality experiences with that, and we either go really close on serving that stable reliable audience really well, and we add value that is over and above you get online, which is why you come to us. And then if you are going to expand, then do you have to expand into bike, or could you be expanding into snow, into trail running, into like in something else, so that you're much more about that, still focusing on passion and outdoors, not necessarily focusing just because it's got two wheels. It's a very different set of motivations, behaviors to buy an analog leisure bike than it is to buy like a Santa Cruz high tower.
So I want to kind of land the plane here with some of the takeaways that you had here that I'm really curious. You know, you've got a slide in here where you talk about the 6 takeaways, but what's the kind of advice that you're sharing based off this with the clients that you work with? I mean, what directions are you mostly pushing them when it comes to what you got out of this?
The first and biggest single take, if you take nothing else from this, is that just because you are currently thinking about selling a particular product or a particular product line of outdoor gear or a service, it's very unlikely that your audience is only engaging in that one outdoor activity. It's likely that their outdoor life is richer and broader than that. Brackets, high spending road cyclists, maybe a little bit different. But overall, if that is the case, then whether it's from you may already have a portfolio that is broad enough, and you should be thinking about that overlap and about where you should be talking them together and how you can maybe bring that together. Or if you think about how you develop, whether you're a retailer or whether you are a brand, how can you begin to understand product development and the way you sort of like build a relationship with these people over time across maybe more than one category? Because I think that's the fundamental thing, is that actually we are seeing people like looking at sort of the outdoor world and sort of hopefully engaging with it in more ways. So understand that is almost like first and foremost. Then there's more like specific learnings, which is like obviously passion lives in social. So picking those 1 or 2 channels that you can be excellent in terms of the content that you create and you provide, and it won't be the same for every brand, but trying to make sure that you're adding value, because there are too many brands in every category, because we work in a world where everyone is starting a running shoe brand or a bike brand not because they've analyzed the market and decided that's a great place to make money. It's because they want nothing more than to make a slightly better product because they think they can and they would like it, or they just love this category or this world so much that they want to work in it. The result is there's too many brands, so there's a lot of content, which is brilliant as enthusiasts. But as a brand, you always have to remember, like, what is the one thing that I am adding to these people's lives in the content I produce, rather than necessarily just think about like what might they be interested in a vacuum of just like presuming that they're just waiting to listen to you. So pick your channel and also work out like what are you going to do brilliantly in that crowded space. There is the I think it's also understanding that if you're going to design your marketing or experience that people interact with your brand, remember there are those two phases. So like and that there will be different channels that work slightly differently. So make sure that you turn up really well for that research phase to earn the sale of the product or the service you're creating that it deserves by turning up well there, and also maintaining that visibility of those channels. Those will be different. And the final thing, I guess, is this is not everyone will have the money to do it at a huge scale, but thinking about the value that starting like a sport activity from a young age or bringing more people into it. Because the one thing we hadn't really talked about, which comes out a little bit in this, but came out really strongly from a piece we did a year and a half before this on the difference between men and women enthusiast cyclists, is also thinking about how inclusive we can be to bring, whether it's like bringing young people in, bringing a wider group of people into our sports, and thinking about, you don't have to boil the ocean, you don't have to do it all yourself as a brand, but think about how can I make sure that I am at least doing my part to like make it more accessible, to make more people come into it, because it's going to benefit you longer term, but also like we're in this because we love doing it, we love these sports, we love this category. We'll feel better if we're also doing our bit to grow it and leave it slightly better than when we found it.
I think my favorite finding piece of data that you pulled out, I don't know if we talked about this before or after we started recording, but you said the overlap between mountain biking and trail running was among the highest. So I guess for anybody running a trail brand out there that needs to develop some mountain bike gear, hit up your boy.
Yeah, and as on a personal note, I'm an equally lousy trail runner and mountain biker. I do them, but I'm bad at both of them. So like, I definitely, I'm always going to have to be a spectator, and so I'm working the sidelines for it. But like, think they're both brilliant things.
Yeah, there's so much to dig into, and you know, we've been chatting for a while here, and there's way more insights in this deck, which will be available in Slack for everyone, but also that Shift Active Media has, and you've done tons of case studies, you've done tons of research. We'll make sure to link everything in the show notes that we possibly can here, so that people can find you and work with you, and you work with a lot of different outdoor brands and cycling and well beyond that. Any other bits and pieces that you want to share about what Shift Active Media does? Or
yeah, I mean, so I've obviously talked about like the key areas we work on in terms of we address hopefully we work with most of our clients very holistically to start with their problem and then work out which part of the business is going to help them the most. The thing that is most recent, so over the last 4 or 5 years since I've joined, we have built out this insight and strategy capability. So we have our own research panel of 12,000 enthusiast cyclists that we built mainly through frustration of trying to find genuine cyclists in mainstream research panels. But that allows us to then, when a client wants to know more about specifically about like gravel riders or high spending riders or EMTB riders, which is very hard, like a really low incidence rate in a global, in a national audience, we can actually go and talk to them and help uncover specific insights. So yeah, that's like, but we also still work with some leading sort of panel providers to do more mainstream research, particularly around stuff like e-bike and transport-based behavior. I think that also just generally when we think about research, this is quite a broad piece that is a really good starting point. But generally what we then work with clients is much more specific questions like, how much should we charge for this? If I can go into any one audience or particular geography, like which one's going to be the biggest opportunity? Where should I turn up, and what specific should I be saying about our new subscription service that means I can actually find more audiences like that and like brief my media agency better? So it does tend to be those specific things that then like help, like we then work more directly with clients. We'll continue to do this more broader thought leadership stuff because it's fascinating for us, and quite often it gives us a reason to talk to people like yourselves and speak to a wider audience. But yeah, we quite often end up getting much more specific and help people solve those really hard questions that quite often can go round and round in circles in management teams, where like it's going to be a big decision. So how do you make sure that you're making the right decision with the limited time and money that you have?
So cool. Steve, any last thoughts? Any questions?
I mean, I still have a whole list of questions on my Google Doc to go through. So we might have to record a second hour.
Yeah, yeah, I think we'll do the fireside chat next time.
Yeah, perfect.
Amazing. Incredible.
It was great. I learned a ton, though. Thank you.
Yeah, Doug, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for sharing this data, and hopefully we'll catch you in Slack.
No, it's been really cool. It's been great to have the conversation, and the podcast is brilliant. So I will see you in Slack.